Exactly 1 year ago, we know what happened 20th of June, and that we saw Russian Deputy Sergei Gavrilo in the seat of Parliament Speaker, and then government used rubber bullets and tear gas against protesters. So what can you say changed after this 1 year, and did the protests and that night have impact?
Well, several things about that. First off, it's a tragedy that what were peaceful protests initially became more violent. There was more efforts to storm the parliament. The police reacted violently. They fired rubber bullets directly at the crowd. And it's a tragedy because Russia's aggression against Georgia, its occupation of part of the territory, and even the actions of this member of the Duma are things that would unite all Georgians. All Georgians agree that this is unacceptable and that Georgia needs to stand together in the face of Russian aggression. So the fact that this became something that was a fight, really, between the government and the protesters it's a shame, it's a tragedy, and it led to ongoing protests and demonstrations that then turned more against the government than against the Russians. In the end, it is a serious loss for the people who lost their eyesight or were wounded in these demonstrations. People can't forget that. But the bright spot in all of this is that it did lead to some important reforms. And initially, the government promised major reforms to the electoral system. They walked that back a little bit. But in the March 8th agreement that was reached between the government and the opposition, you do have a basis for agreement between the government and the opposition on reforms to the electoral system and a path for free and fair elections this October. And that's critically important. And I think what needs to happen now is for all sides to honor that agreement faithfully.
Okay, we will go back to Russia, but first let me ask you about Western positions. Every time Western officials, when talking about Georgian developments, their tone kind of gets stricter and stricter. Like the recent report of 13 congressmen said, quote, Bidzina Ivanishvili, the richest man in Georgia, is a close ally of Putin and involved in destabilizing Georgia on Russia's behalf.
Yeah.
So does it seem to you like that, that he and the Georgian government make decisions that would be desirable for Russia?
So I spoke with the authors of that report, and I'd say it's a report that people in Georgia should pay attention to because it reflects the views of a number of Republican congressmen. It does not reflect the views of the entire Congress, and it's not going to be turned into legislation. And also there are some mistakes in the report as well, and I would count that as among the mistakes. I think that Mr. Ivanishvili is obviously a critically important and powerful player within Georgia, but I think he is much more independent in the way he handles things than, for example, the other person who is mentioned in the report is Medvedchuk, who is a parliamentarian in Ukraine. Putin is the godfather of his children, and he really represents Putin's interest in Ukraine. And I don't think you can compare the role of Mr. Ivanishvili and Mr. Medvedchuk.
So recently, Republican Congressman Don Bacon stated that, commented on the document, and he said that he did not take part in this part of the document, and the experts, technical experts, were hired to do so. In general, to what extent do the experts participate in writing this kind of document, and does Mr. Bacon's statement mean that congressmen, those 13 congressmen, may not agree with the content?
All reports in the Congress and Senate are written by staff. That's what the staff members are there for. They are hired, they work for the congressmen, they work for the committees, and everything is produced by staff members. So these are the experts that they're talking about. Second, just because a report comes out that congressmen or senators sign on to, it does not mean that they are endorsing every word. It reflects, this is a long document about a Republican national security strategy, and they wanted to articulate a position that is rather forceful in pushing back on Russia and adopting a very strong American leadership role in the world. And that's the heart of what the document is trying to do. I wouldn't ignore the document simply because it does reflect the view of a number of members of Congress. I also would not expect the document to be translated as is into any kind of legislation.
Speaking about this position, U.S. Ambassador to Georgia, Kelly Degnan, also stated that this is not official U.S. position, and also you told me that this is not all Congress position. But in general, with different letters and statements made by congressmen, made by members of the European Parliament, there is some kind of impression that Western trust towards Georgia is less and less in time lately. So do you agree with this, and what was the main moment or the main issue that made them show their concern so strongly lately?
I would turn it around, and I would say that I think what you see from the United States or what you see from Europe is a great degree of commitment and aspirations for Georgia. People support Georgia. They want to see Georgia succeed as a country, politically, economically. They support Georgia's security. And these elections that will take place in October are terribly important for the country and for Georgia's relationship with the West. And so I think people are expressing their concerns out of hope and aspiration that Georgia is indeed successful. Why more now? I'd say that as you brought up at the beginning of our conversation, as a result of those protests last summer, there was a real flare-up between the government and the opposition, and it seemed to be moving towards resolution. Then it came apart again, and then with the agreement on March 8th, it seems to be back together again. And there is a sense that it is critically important now that both the government and the opposition stick to that agreement, amend the electoral system, participate fully in Georgia's democracy, and make these elections a success.
If the pre-election and election process does not go in accordance with the Western values, what to expect? What Georgian government should expect for what kind of reaction? Like the statements, more stricter statements, or measures such as sanctions, maybe?
Well, I think what you'll find is that Georgia will have a lost opportunity, which would be tragic for the people of Georgia. There is an opportunity for Georgia to continue enhancing its relationship with the EU, with NATO, with the United States. It has been on this trajectory for years and years over several administrations in Georgia. But I think the risk that Georgia runs is that people from the outside will look at the country and say, it's not ready. It's not a mature democracy. They aren't ready for NATO. They're not ready for the EU. They still don't get it. And as a result, there's no incentive, there's no reason for these countries or institutions to continue their outreach to Georgia. So it would be a huge missed opportunity.
Georgian government says that Georgia doesn't have any political prisoners, but opposition, of course, doesn't agree with that. And also Western officials, like we were talking about it, mentioned this term political prisoners. Do you think Georgia has political prisoners?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to weigh in on this because I know it is exactly a point of disagreement between the government and the opposition. The government says there are none. The opposition says that, yes, indeed, there are political prisoners. The government goes ahead and releases those people anyway while denying they're political prisoners. So I understand the ambiguity that people are playing with. What I think is important is that the judiciary system needs to be fair, impartial, apply the rule of law, and not be used for political means. It's fine for the government and opposition to disagree over particular cases, but everybody in Georgia, both government and opposition, needs to reaffirm a commitment to impartiality in the judiciary, not using it for political purposes, and then using elections as a way of addressing political differences.
In February, you published correct version of your remarks about Russian-Georgian August War, and you said that Putin wanted to block Georgian integration to transatlantic integration. He was angered by rhetoric, but he had his own causes. So nowadays, after 2008, do you think that those causes remain the same, or they changed even slightly, or Russia just has the different kind of leverage, different kind of means that it does not need to occupy the territories of Georgia to achieve its goals?
Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. My view is that Russia is not achieving any goals by occupying Georgian territory. This is costly for Russia. It has created some very weak client territories that it calls states. It is very disruptive for the life of Georgia, but it isn't holding Georgia back. It's not holding back the system politically. It's a vibrant democracy. It's not holding them back in the relationship with Europe. I've argued that NATO should be open to taking in Georgia even while the territories remain occupied, simply by having a no use of force pledge concerning the territories, only supporting the peaceful reintegration of the territories. So I don't think that this is actually doing anything for Russia. On the other hand, I also do not see any change in President Putin's position or Russia's position about the occupation. And that applies to Georgia, to Ukraine, to Moldova. Russia is still seeking to use the occupation of these territories as a way of putting extreme pressure on those countries and trying to create a distance from them and the rest of Europe. I don't think it's working, but I think that is still the policy of Russia.
So with different means, I partly also meant maybe the means of hybrid warfare?
Well, yes, I think if you compare from 2008, where it was regular Russian armed forces rolling into Georgian territory, what they did in Ukraine was more subtle. They used special forces and intelligence forces, unmarked military personnel to seize key assets, take over territories, and then only reinforce with regular military forces where needed, and then set up puppet states and puppet entities inside that it could then claim are independent and deny responsibility. So I think Russia's tactics have moved on in a more effective use of hybrid warfare, but the policy is the same.
In one of your statements, you said that you offered your NATO colleagues, partners, to issue a declaration where they would describe the war, 2008 war, as a terrible tragedy, and they would support ceasefire. But none of the European colleagues supported the idea because, quote, saying the leaders were on their vacations. In general, NATO says that we'll get membership when we are ready, but some say that we are already ready, such as Anders Fogh Rasmussen. And overall, how do you think, what does ready mean? And does Georgia have any power to seem and be seen as ready? Or does the arrival of the proper moment depend on any other actor other than Georgia and NATO?
First off, what is ready? NATO has for years held out standards of democracy, free and fair elections, market economy, rule of law, civil control with the military, interoperability with NATO, contributions to European security as a whole, good relations with neighbors, etc. These have been out there for a long time. Georgia has done better than any other candidate seeking NATO membership at this time. So when people look at Georgia and say, well, how is Georgian democracy or how's the market economy? Georgia has done exceptionally well. That also puts NATO in a position saying, well, is NATO ready? NATO only makes decisions by consensus of all the member states. So for Georgia to be invited to join, it requires every single member of NATO to agree that, yes, we now invite Georgia to become a member. There isn't such a consensus at NATO today. There are several countries that are concerned about Russia. There are several countries that would still point out, the elections, for instance, let's see these free and fair elections. They would point out politicization of the judiciary and say, well, we're not so sure about that. But fundamentally, it is a political judgment by the member states of NATO. Is Georgia ready or not? Now, as far as NATO's policy goes, my view is that it is time. Georgia has done everything that it needs to do. The people who live in Georgia are facing immediate security threats and have been very patient in dealing with them. and need support. And I think that Georgia is indeed ready to be invited to be a member of the alliance, and that there are ways to manage Russia's pressure on Georgia without leading to any kind of military conflict. And so I think that it is time for NATO to be taking a fresh look at this.
Do you think American investments are under threat since the Georgian government terminated the contract with Anaklia Development Consortium? And how do you see all of this in general?
I think that we do have an atmosphere or an image among investors that they're unsure about investment in Georgia. It doesn't mean that it has shut off investment. And I think there's a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding around this as well. So Anaklia had a lot of issues around it, and it wasn't really one of taking away from American investors. It was really a dispute between the private consortium and the government over the financing. And ultimately, the private consortium not being able to put in place the financing, the government not supporting the project perhaps as robustly as that consortium had wanted. So it came apart. But I don't think that in itself is viewed as troubling to investors. There are other instances, however, where investors have felt that the courts have not been a reliable resource in dealing with business disputes. And I think that there needs to be greater confidence in investors in the court system and the rule of law to keep attracting them. I think Georgia's on the right track. I think it has done exceptionally well, especially compared with other aspiring members of NATO at this time. But there's always more to do. And especially when you think about needing to have the economy grow much more quickly than it is growing now after the coronavirus, attracting foreign investment, I would think, would be a top priority for the country.
Okay, and last question. We remember that you played a crucial role in Donald Trump's impeachment process, and now what would be your assessment about his attitude towards the recent developments such as coronavirus and then the situation in the USA following George Floyd's death? And how do you think all of this will shape his pre-electoral and election success, maybe?
Right. Thank you. So I think everything that went before March is largely forgotten. So I don't think impeachment has had any lasting impact, and I don't think some of the other issues, think back to 2017 and the Helsinki summit with Putin. Does anybody really remember that anymore? Not really. I think there are three issues now that are determining the rest of President Trump's term of office, and that will be the most influential in the election where he is seeking re-election. The first of these is the coronavirus itself. Do we avoid a second major spike in infections? The second issue is the economy. Do we have a fast and robust economic recovery? And the third is establishing a sense of justice after the killing of George Floyd and the protests that we've seen across the country. If President Trump is able to address the three of these, the disease, the economy, and a sense of justice, I think he stands a good chance of getting reelected. If, on the other hand, any one of these is seen publicly as failing, then I think it puts his efforts to get reelected at risk and favors instead former Vice President Biden.
Okay, Mr. Kurt, thank you very much for the interview and for this interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eka.